Welcome again to the Trainer Trainer podcast. I'm your host Erik Heijn, and we are talking about bridging the gap between science and practice and vice versa. Today I'm talking with two people I'm a great fan of because of their great project, Applied Police Briefings, but also research you have done about knowledge, skills, abilities, and so on from police with Kirk and Craig Bennell. And maybe it's nice to introduce a little bit of yourself and your background.
Want me to start, Kirk?
Go for it.
All right. So happy to be here, Eric. I know we've tried getting this podcast going for a while now, so it's great to finally be here and to meet you. I've watched your podcasts, and I'm a big fan of your work as well. Craig Bennell, I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, the capital of Canada. I also run the Police Research Lab in our department. So we do applied police research projects. We collaborate with federal, provincial, and municipal services across the country. We collaborate with them to design projects that hopefully answer questions that they have, things that they're being challenged by. Most of my research is around police use of force, the use of de-escalation strategies, police responses to people in mental health crises. So we work with services to design projects around those areas, try to come up with answers to questions that they have, and provide those answers to them so that police officers across the country can hopefully do a better job at the challenging work that they do. As we'll talk about today, part of the challenge that we face is getting that research into the hands of police officers and other police professionals, trainers, and so on. So Kirk and I developed Applied Police Briefings really to try to accomplish that.
Great. Yes.
Thanks, Eric, for having us. Really pleased to be here. So my name is Kirk Luther. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Carleton University. And much like Craig, we do a lot of applied research, applied work with policing organizations. So my area largely focuses on memory and investigative interviewing. So trying to get detailed, accurate, reliable, and relevant information from people all across the spectrum, from adults to children to witnesses, victims, suspects, looking at things like trauma and cold cases. Basically, when the police have a problem or a challenge or a question they don't have the answer to, we conduct some research to try and answer that question. And like Craig said, to make their difficult jobs hopefully a little bit easier. So really great to be here and talk about applied police briefings today.
Yeah, because that's a great research, a resource, I have to say. And can I use a little bit of the time talking about, before we talk about applied police briefings, about this article, which is about knowledge, skills, and abilities for managing potentially volatile police public interactions and narrative review. You've spoken about this, Greg, with Chris Butler in his podcast,
Yep.
which is a great podcast, and I think if people listen to that, they have a lot of information. But I wanted to focus on one thing about the narrative review. That was that, if I'm correct, you did a review of the literature, 10 knowledge, skills, abilities came out of it, and then you interviewed some how do you call it? SMA? What is it?
Subject matter experts.
Subject matter experts, and then there came two new topics. And one of the topics I'm interested in, and that was the one of I have to look it up. Yeah, about being a police officer in a democratic society, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit on that? What does that mean for police officers and for police education?
Yeah, so it was surprising. So as you said, we did a review of the literature, looking for these knowledge, skills, and abilities that sort of had empirical support to show that, to the degree that police officers possess these competencies, they should be in a better position to manage volatile interactions. So we did this review, and these 10 knowledge, skills, and abilities emerged. One of the things from the empirical research that didn't clearly come out was this competency that you referred to, which is understanding what it means to police in a free and democratic society. The other one that didn't come out obviously to us, although that might have been because of the type of search we did, was sort of the use of tactical skills and so on. So I think, I guess to me, and talking to folks like Chris Butler and so on, to me, this was surprising that it didn't emerge clearly from the research literature, because to me it's the fundamental skill, right? I mean, at the core of all policing is understanding what does it mean to police? What does it mean to police in a free and democratic society? And so for example, in Canada right now, I think it's a particularly important issue because I'm sure, like in many other parts of the world, we've seen an increase in protests like no other point in time. It would be on the scale of 100% increase, 1,000% increase in protests. So police officers across this country, in particular here in Ottawa, because we're the capital, a lot of the, we see a lot of protest activity. And these are protests around the George Floyd murder, protests around Black Lives Matter generally, protests around COVID-related issues, and in Canada, vaccine mandates and restrictions on travel because of vaccinations, and political protests and so on. So I think, particularly in today's times, understanding what it means to police in a society where we have freedom of expression and the right to protest and so on. What does that mean for police officers in terms of being able to do their work and balancing all the competing agendas that exist within a country that is multicultural, very diverse views? How do you balance all those competing agendas? Enforcing the law, but allowing people to protest, not infringing on their rights, but making sure that they're safe. Issues around, as a police officer, being able to express your own view, but also being professional within the policing context, knowing where that line is. Again, in Canada, so there were occasions where that was blurred, where certain police officers were getting in trouble for being a bit too active in some of the protests themselves personally, and so what does that all mean in relation to the profession? So I think it captures a wide range of things. I don't think it's, I think it's in our training in Canada, I think it's dealt with in a sort of peripheral way. It's certainly talked about within academy training programs and so on, but I don't think it's dealt with in a very significant way. And unlike some other parts of the world, there isn't a requirement here in Canada that police officers take part in university programs where there's going to be a lot of emphasis on those sorts of questions, right? What does it mean to police in a free and democratic society? We don't have a lot of undergraduate university programs that focus specifically on police studies, and certainly that's not a requirement to become a police officer. So many police officers will go to university and they'll take programs in psychology or criminology or sociology, and certainly, in a very peripheral way, that issue of what it means to police in a free and democratic society will sort of be talked about, but it's not tackled head on. I think that's something that needs to be fully integrated into all police training. I think it should be one of the first questions that's explored is what does it mean to be a police officer? What does it mean to balance all these competing agendas? What does it mean to enforce and protect while also allowing people to have these expressions and so on? And I think, given the state of politics now around the world, and a lot of things happening in the US, that certainly seeps up into Canada. I think certainly in this country, those sorts of questions are going to become more and more important. So yeah, that really came up, unsurprisingly, I think, not in the review as much as these interviews that we did with subject matter experts. And it's not a surprise, because a lot of those experts were police officers that sort of have to deal with that on a regular day-to-day basis. And have to struggle with all of those different agendas and competing interests and real challenges, and how to use their discretion to sort of navigate those waters, and especially if they're not sort of provided a lot of training. So not a huge surprise, I think, that it came up in the subject matter expert interviews, and it came up from several experts that they were surprised that it didn't emerge from our review of the literature, and felt very strongly that this is a fundamental sort of thing. And having a good grasp of those issues allows officers to sort of develop skills around some of the other areas that have come up in the review. We talk about procedural justice, or showing respect for marginalized communities, or and things like that. I think understanding what it means to police in a free and democratic society also forms the basis to develop skills in these other areas as
Yeah.
well. Issues around respect and dignity and protection of rights, and all of this is so fundamental to policing marginalized communities in this country. So it really forms the foundation for a lot of other skill sets that police officers need to possess in order to manage challenging interactions with the public, and manage them efficiently and manage them effectively.
Yeah. And maybe also by staying mentally healthy as a police officer, because if I see the young colleagues here, you have to deal with all those personal values, and then the organizational values, societal values, and you have to navigate. And I'm not sure, has one of you a solution? How would an educational program look like?
That is a good question. I don't have an answer to that. I think, again, I can only speak from a Canadian perspective. I think, in addition to sort of this issue that we've just been talking about, I think, much more work needs to be done on that front in terms of preparing officers. I guess two things. One is preparing them better for the realities of policing. So we just finished a project with our local police service on what we call in Canada realistic job previews, right? So this is at the recruitment and selection stage, making sure that information is being presented to potential applicants and new officers about the realities of policing. Not sugarcoating it, but this is what you're going to be exposed to. The trauma, the administrative work, the moments of boredom peppered with very high adrenaline sort of events, challenges from work-life balance, challenges from the organization, especially in today's age, challenges with the public, maybe not receiving the support that you think you deserve because of the work you're doing. So part of it, I think, is preparing officers better for the sort of job they're getting into, so that they know what they're getting into. I think, at least in Canada, 20, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I think there were a lot of people joining the police because they had family members in policing. My dad was a cop, my grandfather was a cop, I'm going to be a cop. And they had that sort of family exposure. So they knew sort of what policing was. They sort of grew up in a family where they had a front row seat on what policing looked like. But I think nowadays, certainly when I talk to recruits, and a lot of them come from universities, and I go in to our local police service and watch recruit training, that's not the case anymore. Like, they don't have those sort of family connections. They don't have a personal view into policing. So I think it's even more important that police services make sure that the people that are applying to their jobs and getting those jobs know what they're getting into. So I think part of it is that, just so they can be prepared, that they're not shocked 2 years in at how many dead bodies they're seeing, or child victims, and that they're not being supported in the way that they thought, that the public maybe is not as keen on policing as they thought maybe the public would be. So I think part of it is that. And then the other part of it, of course, is better training on mental preparedness, on coping strategies, on those sorts of things, so that when they do encounter stressful things in policing, they have more tools in their toolbox to be able to deal with those. So I think those two things combined, and I don't, I'm sure it varies across the country in terms of how well we do on those things, but I think generally speaking, we could probably do better on both fronts in terms of preparing officers for the reality of their job, combined with giving them the skill sets that are required to deal with the stressors when they do encounter them. I think if we do those two things together and do it meaningfully and do it early at the level of the academy, basic recruit training in our country, I think that will have a huge impact in addition to all the sort of reactive measures that obviously have to be put in place,
Yeah.
like employee assistance programs and chaplaincy programs and peer support programs. Like obviously that stuff needs to be in place. But to the extent that we can allow police officers to sort of proactively deal with these things, to try to minimize the impact of stress before it happens, or allow them to deal with it more appropriately as it's happening, I think will have a pretty significant impact. But in this country, I don't think we're doing as good a job as we could be doing on that front.
Can one of you describe how policing is in Canada? So for a little bit context, here in the Netherlands, I think we have police in the, how do you call it, in the villages. It's, how is it called in English? It's very close to the people, not only doing arrest and control, but also, you're very close and have
Community police.
yeah, community policing and so on. And I think for as long as I can remember, there was quite a good relationship. Of course, the cultural norms were a little bit different, maybe 20, 30 years ago. But I think in general, the public liked the police. And when they came, it was for good reasons and so on. But today it has become a little bit more complex, I think. But I still think that there is a good relationship between. I think there is more trust than mistrust. Although, of course, COVID and all those other things. But
I agree. I think I don't know what Kirk thinks, but I think in Canada, the same thing. I think sometimes it doesn't appear that way. I think, the groups that have specific problems with the police often are well organized in Canada. They have a voice. They use social media very well. So I think sometimes it can appear as if the vast majority of Canadians do not support the police. To be honest with you, I think the vast majority of Canadians probably don't have a strong view about the police one way or the other. They don't interact with the police. They're going about their business.
Yeah.
They're not law violators. The extent to which they might interact with the police, police officers may be a traffic stop. But for the majority of us, we're not interacting one way or the other. I think then there's a group that clearly do support the police. And then I do think there's a relatively small group that don't in this country. Again, it's oftentimes those are the groups that we hear from just because they are vocal in there. And don't get me wrong, I think, some of the issues that they raise are legitimate and we need to think carefully about those issues and make corrections if we need to. But I think it's probably the same here in Canada. I don't know what you think, Kirk, but
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. And just to kind of give the listeners some context to policing in Canada. So as you know, Canada is quite geographically large. And so we have policing kind of at different levels. You have municipal police forces, you have provincial police forces, you have Indigenous police forces, and then we have a federal police force, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP. And so one of the issues that we kind of face in terms of, trying to help enact change and is that it's so kind of siloed, the different kind of police organizations, given the kind of the barriers that are just kind of automatically set up in policing. But that's just a bit more context on that.
And different levels of government in our country are responsible for the different police services. So to sort of come up with a coordinated approach to change policing is a challenge because, the RCMP will report to Public Safety Canada and the sort of federal system, whereas, our municipal services are really responding to their municipality and the provincial police services are responding to the provincial governments and so on and so forth. So it's a challenge to sort of push wide-scale change in this country because of all those moving parts, silos, and so on.
And how is training organized? Because here in the Netherlands, it's of course a very small country. So we have a standardized program for every police officer. And then, of course, when you're a specialist, then you get some additional training, be it on the bike or on horses and so on. But the general training is the same. The weapon systems are the same. Although, of course, if you go to SWAT, you get some additional. But how is that organized in Canada?
Yeah, not the same, I would say, necessarily. I mean, you'd see some standards. There's obviously some consistencies across services, but at the federal level, the RCMP for their basic training are going to go to what they call RCMP Depot in Regina, Saskatchewan, one of our provinces. So the RCMP officers at basic training, they will receive the same training. They're all going to go to Depot. And the RCMP is huge. I mean, we're talking, I don't know what the most recent numbers are, 19,000 officers, because it is across the country, and I think they police about 77% of Canada's landmass. I think it's about 22% of our population, because the RCMP police a lot of northern communities so it's a large landmass, but not a lot of population.
Yeah.
So all of those officers are going to congregate in Regina to do their basic training. So you're going to have consistency there. But then across the provinces, people that are hired into police services are going to go to academies within their provinces. So in the province of Ontario, all police officers that are hired are going to go to the Ontario Police College down in Southern Ontario. So they'll receive training that's fairly consistent, but that doesn't mean that training in a different province for those officers is going to be the exact same. And then services themselves. So once you're done at the Ontario Police College, you're going to go back to your service that has hired you, and many will provide additional training, and you'll start to see differences as well. So between provinces, I think there will be differences. Within services, there'll be differences. Again, I don't want to suggest it's just sort of random, right? I mean, there are some commonalities, and our government ministry that sets the standards for police training in our province, everyone in the province is going to have the same criteria for annual firearms qualification, for example. So there is some standardization across that. But apart from that, in terms of how training is done, how it's delivered, to some extent, the content, you'll start to see differences emerge. The amount of time that police services dedicate to training can vary. So here in Ottawa, with the local city police, they're going to do some training before their cadets go to the Ontario Police College. Then the cadets are going to do the Ontario Police College, and then they're going to come back to the Ottawa Police Service and do more training. And after that, they're going to go on their field officer training. So in Ottawa, that's 50 shifts, so about 500 hours of training with their coach officers. At that level, you'll start to see differences emerge across the services. So kind of a combination of things that are standard and things that are very different.
So now you have done a lot of research, both of you and colleagues of you have done a lot of research. And how is it received, the research? And the follow-up question to that is that one of the reasons you started also Applied Police Briefings?
What do you think, Kirk?
I can take that and give you a breather if you want.
Yeah,
You've been doing the lion's share of it so far. Yeah, so we've been doing, a lot of I would say collaborative research with policing organizations across the country, across the world, and these projects often stem from conversations with our police colleagues. So, like I mentioned earlier, they have questions, they're facing challenges, they don't have the resources maybe to find out the answers to these things. And so that's where us nerds come in. So we can conduct research, and we can try to find ways to help improve their practice, within the constraints that they're working in. I would say the majority of things that we've done has been really well received, because at the end of the day, Craig and I are not police officers, but we understand that the job is really complex, that the job is very, very difficult. And if we can do something to help them, even in a small way, then we feel that we've kind of done our duty, our job. And so Craig came to me with the idea for Applied Police Briefings, because one of the issues that we've come into contact with, working so closely with the police, is that it's so difficult for them to access scientific articles. So as you know, Eric, a lot of these articles are going to be behind paywalls. And so we can't expect officers, to pay $30, $40, $50 per article. And then once they do get access to them, they're written in such a convoluted manner, because that's how scientists have been trained, that, they don't understand what's going on half the time. I mean, I don't understand these articles half the time. And so we had this idea that we need to make research more accessible. We're we're developing applied research, and it's only going to be meaningful or useful if those that we are creating it for, trying to help them, if it's understood by them. And so we decided, well, we need to talk about our research differently. If we're going to get buy-in from police organizations, if we're going to make meaningful changes, if we're going to promote evidence-based practices, we need to change the way that we're kind of doing things. And so that was kind of the idea behind Applied Police Briefings. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Craig.
Yeah, no, similar experience, I think, in terms of receptivity and buy-in. Like, obviously, the services that we're doing research projects with have decided that they value research and they want to use research to help develop policy or practice or change or whatever the motivation is. So I think at that level, there's real buy-in. And, I work with a lot of police leaders, police trainers, police professionals that clearly see the value in research. If they didn't, they wouldn't be engaging with us to do research projects. So I think at that level, there's buy-in. But in terms of the broader policing landscape, that's where we have problems for the reasons that Kirk has described. It's not that there's not buy-in, it's that they don't know what's out there. They're not able to access what's out there. It would be difficult to maybe understand some of it for the reasons that Kirk described, just in terms of the scientific and statistical jargon, and also the length of these articles, right? I mean, 25 pages, who has the time to sit down and read all the research related to use of force training when it's written in that way, even if you can access it? So I think at that level, I wouldn't say there's not buy-in. There's just there are all sorts of roadblocks that prevent anyone that is interested from engaging with the research. So Applied Police Briefings was obviously our attempt to remove some of those roadblocks.
And do you also think that it is a good thing for police trainers and educators to, how shall I name it, be scientific, have a little bit scientific literacy? Because I'm one of those who's reading all those articles, but still I'm sometimes confused. For example, I'm now deeply into the research of emotions, but then you have Lisa Feldman Barrett who have her theories, and then you have other people, and sometimes I get lost even then, and how to interpret it and how to make big conclusions. What do you think? Should there be a course for police trainers how to read an article? The end, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think scientific literacy is important. I mean, regardless of your profession, because being able to understand, the strength of evidence in different areas where the convergence of evidence is kind of pointing to have a critical lens when you're reading things, all of these things are important, I think, regardless of your profession. And so to kind of train police officers with that critical lens, yeah, I mean, I think that would be a net benefit, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, that having that scientific literacy, that critical thinking lens, it allows officers to be better prepared, whether, they're going into court and having to defend their actions or what they did, type of thing. So this really kind of sets them up, it puts them in a better position to, ensure that their actions are defensible. They can point to the science, they can point to the literature on why they did certain things and why they didn't do others. So it's not just, Craig or I saying, oh, this is a good idea to do or not to do. This is what, tons and tons of research has shown, type of thing. One of the issues, or one of the frustrations I often kind of run into, is that, science is a slow process and it takes time to really build up an evidence base or a knowledge base on a certain topic. So I think in that respect, sometimes it would be good to kind of have that scientific literacy as well, so you can understand kind of the bounds that you're working within as a police, trying to understand the science and trying to apply it in your everyday work.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
because yeah, go ahead.
I don't disagree with Kirk at all. I think there's real value in it. Um, just from a practical perspective, I think it's challenging to sort of develop that scientific literacy. Um, Again, part of that is around the educational and training requirements in Canada right now for policing, which doesn't require um, certain types of programs that may allow you to do that a little bit easier. Um, I would say nowadays, the vast majority of Canadian police officers do come into policing with a university degree of some type or a college degree of some type. So to some extent, maybe a little bit of that scientific literacy can be built up in those programs. And I think that's the most obvious place to do it. That being said, as Kirk has sort of alluded to, I mean, both of us went through an undergrad, a master's, a PhD, and have been professors for a while, and I still have challenges understanding, even in my own area, some of the research that is coming out. Um, so while I think there is some value at getting to a certain baseline level of literacy so that, if people want to access research, they can understand most of it. I think from a purely practical value to develop that to such an extent that it's high level would be a challenge in this country, unless some of the educational and training requirements change pretty fundamentally. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's hard to say it's not a good thing to develop. It's just the practicalities of how we do that would be, I think, quite challenging to get it to a level where, an officer can access research that they want to access and fully understand it, because I still experience great challenges doing that with much of the research that I read. So again, APB is sort of a
Yeah.
way of trying to help with that by making it more accessible and more able to be processed in terms of its length and its language and so on.
Yeah, great. So, well, maybe I can show you the winter edition if I can do it here for those who are watching. This is the latest. Is it the latest? I think, eh? Winter
Yes.
20. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, it is.
So this is an example of the volume, and you see here, if we scroll a little bit, table of contents. So what you're doing is you're summarizing a lot of research. Do you also like integrate research in the sense that, for example, if there are three studies about body-worn cameras, is there also how do you call it, a review part, or is it just the studies themselves?
Yeah, so for the moment, we just have the studies themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a great idea to maybe have a summary kind of after sections like that. So the way we've been treating it so far is that we're just really trying to get great police research in the
Yeah.
hands of police officers. And so we've talked about kind of having different themes or thematic organization of the journal, but we're not quite at that stage yet.
But it's great. Eh? And is it possible is there one study in the latest issue of which you're particularly enthusiastic about?
Enthusiastic about all of them.
Yeah, of course.
Um, yeah, I mean, some of the ones that are getting the most attention. So the site that we use to publish this also tracks views and downloads for us. And it's been interesting. They're not, the tracks and downloads aren't necessarily what I expected them all to be. The ones that are, as a group, getting the most downloads are briefs related to women in policing. I would say out of the top five, two of them are, you know, um, like the second one in this issue are related to women in policing, which I don't think is a huge surprise, given that at least in North America, there's great strides to try to increase the number of women in policing, and to do that, we need to understand some of the challenges that women face within this profession and so on. So, yeah.
Can you unpack this study a little bit, or maybe we can do it together because I found this particularly interesting. This is the confidence gap in female police officers' decision making.
Yes. Just for the viewers, so what we
Yeah.
do with this is there's a published piece of research. So you can see in the source article,
Yeah.
there was a piece of research published on decision making by male and female officers, and looking at whether the decisions made by female and officers were sort of correct or incorrect, and the confidence that police officers have in their decisions. So there's a published piece of research, and you can see that in the source article.
Yeah.
And then the briefs take one of two approaches: either the original authors themselves. So in this case, one of the original authors was involved in the writing of the brief. So it could be the original authors of the publication write a brief of their own work, which in this case, it's sort of a mixture. Ricardo was obviously the lead author on the published paper. Or it could be that people disconnected to the original research. So, for example, say a group of grad students are interested in a publication of mine, but they weren't connected to that research that I did. They could write a review of my research and publish it as well. So those are the two ways in which
Yeah.
the briefs happen, but it's always of a published piece of research, and it's
Yeah.
a piece of research that Kirk and I felt was important and timely and impactful, and that the police should know. So in this case here, what I found interesting, so again, if we just go to the take-home messages,
Yeah.
What was interesting is that female and male officers, as I say, performed equally in terms of the time it took to make decisions in various scenarios that were presented to these officers. They were very similar in terms of the perceived difficulty of the scenarios, and they were similar in terms of the appropriateness of their behavior. Where you start to see differences was in the confidence that male versus female officers had in the decisions that they made, and female officers exhibited a lower level of confidence than male officers. What I found particularly interesting, though, is that the actual confidence ratings, there was better alignment between the female confidence ratings and the actual quality of the decision than there was for the male officers, in the sense that the decisions that were made by both the male and female officers in many cases were quite poor. Low confidence that the female officers exhibit was actually in line with the fact that the decision was quite poor, whereas the male officers sort of exhibited an overconfidence. So I think there's a tendency to maybe view this confidence issue in a negative way because females are less confident than males. But in fact, the confidence ratings, if I remember this brief correctly, the confidence ratings by the females was actually more in line with the quality of decisions that were being made. But they do speak to in this brief about like what can be done, not only about the decisions, but what can be done to enhance the confidence that female officers have in their decision making. And part of they explored in this paper, why do these confidence differences emerge? And some of the, it's speculation to some extent, but some of the differences they suggest are because females officers are making these decisions within a male-dominated, very masculine, conservative police culture, which may make them question their decisions. One of the scenarios, for example, that was provided was a scenario where a reasonable degree of physical strength would be required to make the appropriate decision. And this was a scenario where female officers exhibit quite low confidence. Again, that might make sense just given differences in strength and stature between male and female officers, especially when those decisions are being made in this male-dominated, masculine sort of culture. So yeah, they talked about potential ways to remedy the situation in terms of training, in terms of slowly changing this culture. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And Kirk, do you have in this edition, is there a study you particularly like, or?
So, like Craig, it's really difficult to pick one. I'd have to go back to the table of contents and
Okay,
look
yeah,
at it.
okay.
But Eric, one of the things that I wanted to mention is how
Yeah,
we've kind of structured the briefs.
yeah,
Uh,
great.
so basically, what we want to do is have a title page that outlines, as Craig mentioned, the source article. So this is all peer-reviewed research. So it's
Mhm.
gone through kind of the ringer of the scientific process. And yeah, we want to have the take-home messages right there, right away for people. So if you don't have time to read the full brief, you can kind of see what the main findings are. And then essentially we want to break down, things like what did the original authors do? Why did they do it? How could this be useful for policing? So really try and structure the articles in such a way that makes them useful for the audience that we're trying to get to.
Yeah, and you do a great job because it's very easy to read. It's great to have the take-home messages in how do we say at the start of the article. Can I ask a question about one of the articles? I'm not
Yep.
sure. I can imagine you don't have all the articles on top of mind right now, so we can. And that's about constant letter approach. Where is it?
Oh, page 11 there.
11, yeah. Yeah, it's 11.
And that's the
I,
other thing. Everything is hyperlinked in the article, so
yeah,
you can
great.
contents and quickly get to places and so on.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, and people can just download individual articles as well if they
great.
want from the
Yeah.
website.
I talked with Sven also on the podcast, and he's close to us in the Netherlands. It's our neighbor in Germany, and they do an enormous amount of research. I'm together with Mario Staller. They publish. I have the impression they publish an article every week, but
It's a lot.
it's a lot. And this is interesting. I'm also a human movement scientist and interested in motor learning, and I struggle a little bit with the constant led approach. Not with the approach itself, because as a teacher at the University of Physical Education, I use the constraint led approach. But I also see that it is, how do you call it? Uh, I'm searching for the kind words. I think there are other methods working as well as constraint led. And so here you do a nice job of the Kerner-Staller article, Police Training Revisited, in which they make a case for the constraint led approach. But then in the article in the sources you refer to this is not a critique, or this is just how I try to make sense of research. Then there is an article by Kerner, There Must Be an Ideal Solution, where they concretely research the difference between explicit and implicit instruction, between traditional versus constant led approach, dealing with a knife attack, and so on. Okay, so the constant led approach produces more creative solutions in the test, more than the direct instruction and so on. But then it's one study, and how should we as scientists communicate that?
That's a good question. I mean, again, I don't want to speak for Sven and
No, of
Mary,
course not. No.
um, their views and how they feel. But I mean, you're right. I think there's two issues. One is how do we effectively and responsibly communicate about research
Yeah,
when there isn't a significant base of that research. So I think that's one issue. And the other issue is how do we uh, how do we be confident in generalizing research from one domain into a different domain?
exactly.
Because outside of Mario and Sven's work, I wouldn't say there's a great deal of research that has evaluated a constraints-led approach within this context of policing. So to some extent, we have to generalize from research in other fields, with other sorts of tasks and other sorts of challenges and pressures into the field of policing. So again, I think that's one area that we have to think carefully about, the degree to which we can generalize from one area to another. And then the issue you raise about sort of having a relatively small evidence base to sort of draw conclusions about, and the degree to which we feel we can confidently do that. So again, I don't think there's any simple answers to either of those questions. To me, it depends the level at which you're talking about things. Myself personally, I feel that there is enough similarities between the nature of the motor skills, for example, that officers are needing to demonstrate, and enough similarity in the context within which they're having to demonstrate those, i.e., being high stress, high physiological arousal, high consequence sorts of decisions. I think there's enough similarity between the skill sets and the context within which those skills are being demonstrated between policing and the fields where this research is being done to warrant the attention that the constraints-led approach is now getting within a policing context. And I think my personal view is that there's value in that approach, given that research. But I think you have to carefully assess that, right? You have to carefully assess the degree to which the skill sets are comparable and the context within which those skill sets are being demonstrated are comparable in order to determine how confident one needs to be. I think as the research accumulates, certainly it seems to be being done more and more in a sports context and just a more general movement context. I think that will increase our confidence, but we need to start getting this work done in a policing context specifically. And certainly our research program here in my lab, we're definitely going to focus on that moving forward. So I'm personally convinced of its value. Again, I think like you, Eric, I'm not suggesting it's sort of the end all and be all and that we rely on this approach and exclude other approaches. I think there are many approaches that can be brought to bear on the challenges that police officers face. But I'm certainly convinced of its value enough to, having taken training by Chris Butler, who certainly is a big advocate of this sort of approach. I'm convinced of its value enough to suggest that we should start incorporating it and examining it and evaluating it within a policing context so that we can start developing an evidence base to prove its value, but also how it needs to be tailored to specific policing contexts. So again, I don't have good answers to your questions. I think they're fair questions, and I think both researchers and police professionals need to be very careful around generalizability and how much weight we put on evidence when there isn't a strong base. But I think for me, it's accumulated to such an extent that I think there's value. I think it would absolutely, in a Canadian context at least, given the training I've seen, I think it would absolutely move the needle forward. I think it would move us in the right direction. I think it would allow our research to be much more realistic compared to what it currently is. And it provides a nice structured way of thinking about how to enhance realism and why we're doing that. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, you're answering my question. And it's because my own struggle also, because years ago I started to publish, I tried to translate some articles, some research articles, and posted them on LinkedIn for my colleagues and so on. But then I realized that sometimes they pick a study, I had only one study, and and they pick it, and then it was the kind of truth, and then I became a little bit worried myself. But I don't have the time to do a meta-analytic review every time about every topic. So how to balance, how to communicate this. You said it already. How to communicate this to colleagues, but at the same time making them aware that if it's only one study, it's not the end and all. So that's.
Yeah, so Eric, I think that kind of goes to your earlier question about, the importance of scientific literacy and really having these really close collaborations with practitioners. So you're able to have these discussions and say, look, this is a current best evidence, but we're always learning something new with science and research. It's always evolving. And while this could be the gold standard right now, it may not be in a couple of years. And so being able to adapt and to change policy and practice based on when new evidence comes out is crucial as well. So things like what we're trying to do with APB to keep people up to date, abreast on
Yeah.
on the newest research, but also having really just kind of close collaborations with
Yeah.
police organizations, practitioners, trainers, management. And so yeah, you have these conversations on a regular basis type of thing.
And do you also help people or institutions with the implementation of these ideas? So, for example, if one of my colleagues is reading, or maybe a police department is reading the briefings, how how can they implement it? Is there any, or do you have any thoughts about it?
Yeah, for me, I mean, the first thing I would do, so as editors of APB, I think both Kirk and I are clear on what our roles are, which is try to enhance dissemination, enhance
Yeah.
clarity, research findings, and so on, versus assisting police officers with the implementation of some of the ideas. So if a police service, a police professional reached out to me, they just read a brief, they're very interested in it, they see value in it. The first thing I would do is put that police professional in touch with the original authors. They're certainly in a much better position than I think Kirk and I are to assist with implementation. A lot of these briefs, because we're trying to go broad spectrum and really get the
Yeah.
full range of from crime reduction strategies to improvements in training to sexual assault investigations to investigative interviewing. I'm not an expert on 98% of what we publish, so I think the researchers themselves are in the best position to be aware of the broader research base within the area. They probably have expertise in helping police service implement findings in their area. So that would be the first stop, is the original authors. And that's our goal, right? Is to create those conversations within police
Yeah.
service that, wow, this is valuable. Like I could see that improving what we do in that area in our police service. We need to learn more. We hope that it sparks those conversations with the original authors and that they start having conversations that we don't even know about,
Yeah.
and that they're bringing in colleagues, and hopefully the original researchers have experience working with police services to implement some of these ideas. So that's the whole point of this, is not, I don't think, necessarily to read a bunch of research that they didn't read before. It's to come up with ideas of how to improve what they do, and that will hopefully move beyond APB to these other conversations. One point I did just want to quickly make about, and it's a potential disadvantage of the style that we do in APB, related to sort of this single study concern that you raised. Because the briefs are brief, right? We keep them to 2 pages. I've been told many times working with police services, basically, if you send this up to the chief and it's much longer than 2 pages, they may not have time to read it. So we specifically kept it to 2 pages to increase accessibility, decrease the amount of time it takes to read it. One of the downsides of that, though, of course, is that authors of these briefs can't do justice to the research area. So, I think within the area of sports research, movement science research, and so on, there's a reasonable base for constraints-led approach to training and its advantages. That isn't necessarily reflected, obviously, in this brief because of the way the brief was written, i.e., it has to be brief. So I think readers have to be a little careful reading these briefs, because I don't think it gives them a sense of the field.
Yeah.
It doesn't even give a sense of the fulsome nature of the study that we're citing. So what I would recommend as well, in addition to getting in touch with the original authors, one of the reasons to do that is to get access to the full article. If an article is really of interest to a police professional, I wouldn't say base decisions on the APB brief. You really want to get in touch with the original authors. You want them to send you the original piece of research so that you can read the entirety of what they've said. And then you need to engage in conversations with those people. APB is really about, for me, is really about providing an access point to learn more about the research.
Yeah. It's great. Yeah.
in a way that is not happening right now. So
Yeah.
yes, you're going to be able to see the research and you're going to be able to understand whether it has value for you. After that point, that's when you're going to have to dig in more and learn more about that research by talking to the original authors, by reading the original research and so on.
Yeah.
So it's a starting point rather than an end point. And in part because the briefs can't do justice to the original article. This was I don't know how long this article was, but it could have been a 25-page article reduced to 2 pages. So I think we have to be careful of seeing the authors of briefs and interpreting what they're doing as cherry picking, because I think in their original authors, there's probably a lot of work that's been done to show
Yeah.
that there's a broader base of research than may appear to be the case in the briefs.
Yes, I have always the same when I read an article. I want to read the abstract and have some concrete. But if I read the article in real detail, for example, the Staller study with the knives, there was also a nice, interesting thing. Just for example, not about topic, but there was a nice, interesting part, if I remember correctly, that although students progressed good in the implicit learning, there was also a group who needed some explicit instruction for their self-confidence, just like these details.
Right.
And for example, in the Netherlands, we have a professor who is the pioneer of motor learning here in the Netherlands, Peter Beek. He wrote a 10-part update on motor learning recently. But then when I read all those articles for my, how do you call it, lessons to the students.
Yep. Yep.
But then I talked with him, and it was a little bit more nuanced.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
For sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
Kirk, what kind of studies are you involved in, and are they also in APB?
Absolutely, yeah. So a lot of the studies that I'd be involved in would be related to the interviewing worlds. So actually, one of my graduate students, Harper, had written a brief on some research that I had published. We do briefs on memory, and false confessions, and virtual interviewing. So that kind of area. So as Craig said, we're really casting this wide net to try to appeal to a large audience and
And
yeah, really get
are
interested
there
in
some
APB.
are there some silver linings from your research? Like how far is it in research? What do we know a little bit better than yesterday about memory, about
Yeah,
the
yeah. Absolutely. So one of the things that we've been working on is the mock transcript technique. So a very simple and effective way to kind of increase motivation, cooperation, and information provision in an interview room. So something as simple as showing a mock interview transcript very briefly, just to kind of set the stage for what's expected of an interviewee. So when we think about someone being interviewed by the police, it's very likely going to be a new, novel, unique concept for them. They're going to base, what they're going to do on what they see on movies and TV shows, and that's not how the interview actually goes. And so by setting the stage, by setting the expectations in a very quick and simple manner, we get a lot more information from people, a lot more investigative relevant information, fewer kind of memory errors that are kind of creeping in. So really simple things to try and improve practice.
Great. And Greg, talking about evidence-based practices, in your article, you sum up 10 of those. How is it with de-escalation? I talked with Robin Engel, by the way.
Yep. Yep.
But what is I'm not sure, is this also your area of interest, de-escalation?
Yeah. We look a lot at that. I think Robin's work is, she's a real leader in this field. And it's amazing to me the amount of attention that de-escalation is getting in policing. It's amazing how little research there is that is specific to de-escalation, especially around de-escalation training programs. Robin's evaluation of the programs that she's evaluated, like those are one of the very few evaluations that exist, and yet we all know de-escalation is so critical to policing. It's being talked about more and more, especially on the heels of the George Floyd murders and so on. Like it's everywhere. It's pervasive in policing, and yet there's so little research on the topic, and especially such little research evaluating de-escalation training programs. So I think Robin's research is amazing. Her evaluation of the ICAP program is again extremely novel. I know that a lot of Canadian police services are adopting ICAT training, which is the program that she evaluated. Um, and yeah, lots of work being done there. Our own work, we've sort of taken it back to basics, and we're looking a lot at things like, how do we define de-escalation across this country? It's defined very differently.
Yeah.
Different police services in our province will define it very differently. So we think developing some standard, consistent definitions of that. And once we do that, what does the training need to look like? Um, I think it needs to be obviously fully integrated. There's sort of a misconception that sort of use of force and de-escalation are somehow distinct and different, but of course, in the real world, they blend, right? Oftentimes you have to transition between de-escalation efforts and use of force and back and forth and so on. Certainly, based on many people's definitions, de-escalation can involve elements of force or certain types of force. Even sort of red dot displays from a taser, for example, can very quickly, without even deploying it, can very quickly calm situations down. There's been some good research in hospital settings sort of showing that. So again, understanding the relationship between use of force and de-escalation, both from a definitional issue, but also from a training issue, and what that all looks like. And making sure that the training that we deliver goes beyond improving attitudes and changing knowledge to actually having an impact on behavior, right? I think this was in Robin's work, this was the big addition of her work, is that it was one of the first times that her and her team were able to show that there is training out there that can actually impact behavior. There'd been a lot of work on various programs showing that it can improve attitudes towards community members, that it can enhance knowledge of various things. But very little work showing that you can create meaningful behavioral change, reductions in use of force, reductions in injury, and so on. So I think, her work was very important in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I've also thought about I talked about your article when I was doing the course in the police academy, but then I suddenly became a little bit worried in the sense that can I also use these key knowledge, skills, abilities as a format? Because I made a list, then I let them answer if this is into their training here in the Netherlands. But would it be a good idea? Is that a good idea, or do you suggest doing the same thing here in the Netherlands because maybe the context is different? What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I always think it's important to understand these issues within the context within which they're being sort of implemented. That being said, I think those skills are, I think, so fundamental to many of them are so fundamental to any human interaction that I would be extremely surprised if, just logically, the first one, enhancing knowledge of law and policy. Like, it doesn't matter where you are working. Obviously, you need to understand how your organization's policy and how the laws that govern your behavior in your area are, how those should influence the way you interact with people. And understanding those things is obviously going to improve the nature of those interactions. Showing respect and having good, effective interactions with vulnerable populations, again, and what that looks like. Again, knowledge of mental health issues, I assume, in most police jurisdictions around the world, police officers are having to deal with a lot of calls where people are experiencing various forms of crises, whether it's mental illness driven or situational crises. So I think a lot of the KSAs that are identified in that paper are very likely to generalize everywhere. Yes. And they're just fundamental to human interactions, period. If we want this interaction to go well, a basic level of respect and dignity and trustworthy motives, that you're not going to take this podcast and use it for, you know, to make me and Kirk look like idiots and so on. Like, I mean, it's at the root of so many interactions that, of course, we should treat people in a procedurally just way. And I think there's enough research behind a lot of these to suggest that they do actually already generalize across cultures and situations. So, yeah, while clearly there would be value in having interviews with subject matter experts and community members in your own area to ensure that these KSAs are meaningful and that possessing competencies around them are going to improve situations, I would be very surprised if that wasn't the case. I think it's more in the nuances, right? The laws and policies will vary. The frequency of interactions with people with mental illness, the nature of the diverse communities that your officers are interacting with, like all that will vary. So while in Canada, for example, one of the groups that I think we need to do a much better job understanding how to interact with them are Indigenous people in this country, our First Nations people. Of course, that might not be an issue in your part of the world to the same extent that it is here. There's a long history of police interactions, negative police interactions with First Nations people in our country. And I think we need to develop a better understanding of that so that we can have more effective interactions with those folks. Police officers can have more effective interactions with those folks. So I think in terms of the nuances about, you may have marginalized populations that are different than ours, but I think at a higher level, of course, we need to understand better how to interact with those folks. We need to understand the biases that we personally possess around those individuals. We need to find ways of managing those biases. We need to have greater cultural sensitivity and cultural competency. But again, the groups that you're interacting with may be different than ours. So I think the concern about just taking this stuff and plopping it into your environment is more around those nuances. It isn't that your officers have to be able to deal with marginalized groups. It's we need to understand better. You need to understand better when interacting with those folks, which are the marginalized groups we interact with, and what are the specific issues in relation to those marginalized groups that your officers need to understand in order to enhance those interactions. And that might be quite different than what we would do here in Canada. So I think it depends on the level at which you're talking.
Yeah, of course. Do you think we are making progress? Because say, for example, that we use this as a reference point, summing up all the cases and the literature and the evidence. Are we making, question to both of you, are we making progress?
I personally think we're making progress both on the research front in terms of understanding these KSAs and how they relate to policing. And some of the issues around these nuances. I do think we're making slow progress in relation to that. And I think, at least in a Canadian context, I do think we're making progress in terms of developing these competencies within our police officers. Certainly in Ontario, for example, I think there's been a lot of work done recently around things related to mental health training for all of our officers. We now have a standardized program in this province around that topic. I think cultural competency and sensitivity, I think we're doing a much better job in procedural justice training. Most police services in this province would be implementing their own version of procedural justice training. I think we've always done a pretty good job around tactics and use of force. And we continue to do a better job there. I think the improvements there are going to be around, having talked about this constraints-led approach, it'll be around improving the pedagogy in terms of delivery of training. So yeah, I'm pretty confident. Is there room to improve? Of course, right? There always is. And we'll do that. But I think there are a bunch of competencies that I think we've always done a pretty good job in this country developing. And then the areas, sort of the softer skills like procedural justice, mental health training, de-escalation training, where I don't think we necessarily have done a good job. Yeah, I've seen pretty significant improvement over the last 5 years or so. Not because of this paper, obviously. Those things, many of them are happening already. So yeah, I'm in this country at least. I'm pretty optimistic. I can't speak for other places.
I think also here in the Netherlands, I also think that we have a situation right now that if we only could implement the research there already is, it would be, and of course it's very difficult in a running organization, but Raoul Audians, he's also one of the researchers in the Netherlands. he once did a study where they, I think it was for music and dancing students. If I'm not sure. It was a different target group, but they had done a lot of research about performing under pressure. They had made all kinds of great fact sheets and so on, but they still didn't use it. So then they asked the question, how we have made it so accessible, we have done the research, and then they went into the organizations and tried to guide them with the implementation. And so they discovered also what hinders the implementation. So I think
Yeah,
that would be you also need people to translate it, eh? Or close
yeah, I mean,
collaboration, yeah.
yeah, it always comes down to the implementation, right? I
Yeah.
mean, good intentions are important, but at the end of the day, if you can't implement it, and that's challenging, as you say, right? I mean, there's financial issues,
Yeah, time,
there's
yeah.
resourcing issues in terms of both manpower, woman power, and infrastructure, making sure you have the necessary infrastructure, whether that's gym space, range space, computers, whatever the infrastructure is, classroom space. Um, there's cultural issues about making sure that the people that are in charge are all on the same page and they agree with the training and want to implement it. Pedagogical issues around making sure that trainers are sufficiently trained themselves in terms of how to deliver training. Like there's just such a range of issues that
Yeah.
the original training design may be great, learning objectives may be fantastic, the content may be very evidence-based and relevant, but you still gotta, at the end of the day, it's gotta be, there's some great training that I know of that takes a long time, right? I think everyone agrees that it is a valuable training, but it takes a long time to deliver the training. And I've now seen that training being implemented, and it's done in a fraction of the time that the original researchers intended it to be. And I'm pretty confident that the training that I've seen is probably a complete waste of time.
Mhm.
They think they're delivering it. They've called it the right thing, but what they're actually doing is very different than what is needed and what the research suggests they need to do. They would be better off not doing it at all and spending that half day on something else that they can manage within a half day.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it all comes down to implementation, and it all comes down to evaluating the implementation, which
Also, yeah.
I think police services are horrible at doing, generally speaking, is a robust evaluation of the training. Um, uh,
You
often,
are I think you are aware of Chris Cushion's great work in the
yes,
UK, eh? Because they did a how do you say it? Field evaluation.
yes.
And on the basis of that, he developed his scenario-based training. So that's a great example
Oh, it's
of research and practice and combining it,
yeah,
eh?
yeah. Chris Cushion's work, as a researcher, I think he's phenomenal. And the work that he's recently done in the UK, I think, is very, very impressive. I think should be a sort of model for how
Yeah.
again, obviously the UK, the context is very different than a sort of Canadian context. So again, there's challenges sometimes doing that and generalizing from a UK sort of policing model. But to the extent that that could be mimicked, it's very impressive for
Yeah.
sure.
And one of the frustrations we've run into as well, so if you get something implemented and you get buy-in, people are trained on it, is that you have skill decay because there's no kind of feedback mechanisms in place to maintain the skills and kind of keep improving on those skills as well.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't matter what we're talking about in policing, it's just like any other skill that you learn. You can't be taught at one time and become an expert at it. You have to receive feedback. You have to receive some sort of refresher training to maintain those skills and yeah,
Yeah.
improve.
What are your ambitions with the briefings? What would you what are you very enthusiastic about?
Go ahead, Kirk.
Yeah, so I mean we have a few. So this is still very early. We've got our third issue out. The uptake so far has been great. I can't speak for Craig, but I mean it's better than what we've imagined. So we want to keep growing that audience. We want to ensure that it's useful for police practitioners, for the readers. And so we want feedback from people in terms of if there's something else that they want to see. We want to, we've been talking about other things that we can kind of add to the journal to keep making it more useful. So whether that's trying to make, some relevant and new case law more accessible, so have kind of briefs on those, whether that's some case studies that we could highlight where things went well or didn't go so well and use that as, a learning exercise for people. And perhaps, turn it into podcasts as well. So if you don't have time to read, you can listen to people talk about the articles. So we've been kind of playing around with some AI generated podcast. Of course, is not as good as what, you are doing, Eric. But it gives us a chance to, again,
Absolutely.
reach a broader audience. So we're toying around with different ideas, but ideally we want it to become the go-to resources
Yeah.
for police practitioners. And yeah, if they want to know about the evidence on something, we want it to be the first place that they turn to.
And I can imagine that it is a lot of work because I'm doing it myself a little bit, but if you want to do it good, you look it over twice at least.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And to
Yeah. And
summarize
even then
such,
we still find mistakes and errors.
yeah,
So,
that I can imagine.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of that is one of the things, because right now it's all volunteer run.
Yeah.
Kirk and I volunteer, the people that are assisting putting the journal together volunteer. Obviously, the brief authors are volunteering, and it does get sent out for review, and reviewers are volunteering. So it's all volunteer run, and just a shout out to obviously all the people that help us
Yeah.
directly with the
Yeah.
journal and with the reviews, and obviously the authors themselves. It's amazing that everyone's been willing to do it, and clearly we all have the same desire to improve policing, and that's why people are doing it. But especially if we sort of want to expand it or take it to the next level, I don't think it's necessarily sustainable that everyone involved in it is volunteering. So one of the things that we will be looking for is we are looking at potential funding opportunities from agencies within Canada that fund sort of journal activities. It'll never turn into anything that is not free and totally open access. The whole point of this was to make it free and open access. So none of the things that we're looking at will ever change that. Um, and I'm not sure that Kirk and I will necessarily ever get paid for it, and nor do I feel I want to, but sort of editorial assistants and the folks that are helping us sort of format it. And, both of us have talked about maybe having a bit of money to hire a graphic designer to sort of elevate the appearance of it and so on and so forth. That all takes money. Um, so I think that's one of the things that we're looking to do. And the other thing I think we're looking to do is in order to expand its reach, we are looking to have it endorsed by a variety of organizations
Yeah.
that are important organizations around the world. If we can get them to endorse it, I think what that will do is enhance the readership. So it will allow it to be included in various newsletters that those organizations send out. It will just raise awareness of it and get it in front of more people. So for me, getting a funding base to maybe take it to the next level and sort of expanding readership through endorsement of various organizations, I think for me in the next year or so are sort of key priorities, in addition to sort of looking at ways like Kirk mentioned of expanding the content to make it more relevant and useful, like these summaries of new case law that might be important for police officers to understand and so on.
And before you know, it's a full-time job.
That's right. It feels like it
Yeah.
some days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has. I mean, it's great, right? Because
Yeah.
the receptivity has been way better than we thought.
Yeah.
But with that, yeah, it means that we want to keep it going and
Yeah.
Yeah.
get a lot of briefs out. And, we've decided on 4 issues a year. It's actually, it is full time to make sure that, we have enough briefs in the hopper to take care of the
Yeah.
next issue and the next issue and
Yeah.
the next issue. So, yeah, it's been good, but busy but the response both from the research community in terms of submitting stuff has been amazing. Like
Oh,
there are clearly a ton of researchers that are interested in getting their research into the hands of policing, which is great.
great.
Uh, and then in terms of readers, yeah, the download rates are much higher than I think both of us expected. So clearly people are reading it, which is fantastic. And hopefully we don't have an ability to track who is downloading, but hopefully a lot of the people downloading are police professionals.
Yeah.
That's the audience that we want it to get to. So hopefully that's the case.
well, at least I'm promoting it here in the Netherlands because it's a great resource also for myself. Like it's so attractive to have all those. You can just read the papers, the titles, the summary, and then if I'm interested, I'm going any deeper. And it's great. It's a great inspiration. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for promoting it.
Yes, thanks, Eric.
Did I forget a question to ask?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. It's been great.
Yeah.
Been looking forward to this, so it's nice to finally do it.
Yes, no, it's great for me, and if I'm not forgetting anything, then maybe do you have one more nice literature or book tip for police trainers, or to podcast, or what do you personally like regarding research or research books?
Yeah, so I'll give a shout out to CREST, the Center for Research and Evidence on Security Threats. So it's a combination of different universities and security organizations in the UK, and they also put out a regular publication called the CREST Security Review, or CSR. So it's broader beyond policing, but it will include some areas of overlap, some areas of interest. They have a bunch of free resources as well. So I think that would be a great thing for police professionals to check out.
And of course, Chris Butler's podcast is great.
Yeah, there's so many.
Yeah,
I think there's so many great podcasts now.
Yeah.
To be honest, yours obviously. Yeah, Chris Butler's Trainer's Bullpen is, I think, an amazing resource, and I know he's getting a lot of viewers.
Yeah.
There's just so many, and I think that's like really, there's no excuse anymore, right? Like trainers have access to
Absolutely.
a lot of resources. It just
Yeah.
takes the motivation to sort of take advantage of it. And I know people like you and Chris are so open to having conversations with trainers. Yeah, it's just such a different world with everything being so available now.
Yes, you really.
So, yeah, I would just recommend that, whether it's APB or
Yeah.
podcasts, or we have a great organization in Canada called CAPE, Canadian Association of Police Educators. They, run a yearly conference. No excuse not to attend that. It's affordable, and you can learn from other educators that are embedded within policing. So much easier than it used to be.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know that. So I would just recommend those resources, really.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, and I will say goodbye to you, and then offline I want to say a little goodbye off the record. So thank you for
Thanks,
listening, and I will publish, of course, the Applied Police Briefings in the show notes, and for every trainer, I would highly recommend it. So thank you so much, and till next time.